Number 1. Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof did not storm into history with chaos or noise. He entered quietly enough that no one saw him coming. Born on April 3, 1994, in Columbia, South Carolina, he was raised in a fractured household that shifted between divorced parents and temporary living situations. Teachers recalled him as withdrawn but not disruptive, the kind of student who blended into the background. He never held a steady job, never built real friendships, never made plans beyond the walls of his bedroom. Instead, he spent years online, sinking into echo chambers that fed his growing resentment. He began documenting thoughts in private writings, beliefs that painted the world as an enemy he needed to confront. On June 17, 2015, Roof walked into Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, one of the oldest historically black churches in the South. It was a Wednesday evening Bible study. Just a dozen attendees sat in a circle in the basement room, Bibles open. When Roof entered, they greeted him without hesitation. They welcomed him into their sacred space. He took a seat among them, pretending to participate, listening as prayers were spoken aloud. For 45 minutes, he sat silently. No one knew that tucked inside his fanny pack was a concealed Glock handgun, fully loaded. No one suspected that the stranger among them had come not to join, but to destroy. When he finally stood up, it was sudden. In seconds, panic filled the room. Survivors later reported that he said almost nothing. No warning, no shouting, just action. By the time law enforcement arrived, 9 members of the congregation had lost their lives where they prayed. Roof fled into the night as calmly as he had entered. There was no attempt to hide his identity, no disguise, no sense of urgency. It was as if he believed this moment alone would define him forever. The next morning, his face was everywhere. Police released surveillance photos and vehicle descriptions. The public was urged to stay alert. Just 14 hours after the attack, a woman in Shelby, North Carolina, spotted a suspicious car pulling out of a gas station. She quietly dialed police. Officers approached carefully. Roof did not run. He did not resist. He stepped out of the car with an eerie calm and surrendered. The entire country watched footage of his arrest, stunned by how ordinary he appeared. No rage, no panic, just stillness. During interrogation, Roof spoke openly. He described his actions without hesitation or remorse. Investigators listened in silence as he justified his decisions through twisted logic he had built online. He even asked officers if he would be allowed to watch television in jail. It was chilling, not just for its cruelty, but for its detachment. The charges came swiftly. In federal court, he faced 33 counts, including hate crime resulting in death and obstruction of religion. Prosecutors emphasized the deliberate planning behind his actions, his online manifesto, photos of him posing with firearms, even the route he had taken to the church. They argued that this was not a spontaneous act. This was a mission he had crafted carefully over months. The trial began in December 2016. Roof chose to represent himself during parts of the proceedings, refusing to allow his lawyers to argue mental illness. He insisted there was nothing wrong with him. Inside the courtroom sat survivors and family members of those who had been lost. When they addressed him directly, many offered forgiveness. They spoke of grief, but also of faith. Roof stared forward without response. Federal prosecutors presented evidence piece by piece: 911 calls, surveillance footage, and Roof's own recorded confession. Jurors remained silent as they listened. Some wiped away tears. Others avoided eye contact with the defendant altogether. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty on every count. The sentencing phase followed immediately. Prosecutors demanded the death penalty, arguing that the gravity of the act left no alternative. Roof spoke only once during sentencing, saying, "I still feel like I had to do it." No apology, no reflection, just confirmation of what everyone already knew. He was unrepentant. Outside prison walls, the impact of his actions continued to ripple. Charleston mourned, but it did not fall silent. Emmanuel AME Church reopened soon after the attack. Memorials were built. Prayer vigils filled the streets. The families of the victims became advocates for unity rather than vengeance. The very community Roof had hoped to divide refused to fracture. His name became synonymous not with strength, but with isolation. He believed he would spark fear across the nation. Instead, he became a symbol of how hatred ultimately leads nowhere, except to silence, steel doors, and eternal confinement. Number 2, Anders Behring Breivik. Anders Behring Breivik was not a man who acted on impulse. He was a man who waited. He spent years in silence, building a story in his head long before the world ever heard his name. Born on February 13, 1979, in Oslo, Norway, his childhood was marked by instability. His parents divorced early, and his father, a diplomat, distanced himself completely. His mother struggled to manage him emotionally, often describing him as distant and difficult to reach. As a young boy, he was quiet, polite, but withdrawn. Teachers saw no signs of aggression. He followed rules, avoided conflict, and never attracted attention. As a teenager, Breivik chased acceptance through appearance, obsessing over gym workouts, expensive clothes, and image. When popularity didn't come, he turned inward. He abandoned social life and spent countless hours alone in online forums. There, he replaced reality with ideology. He read articles, manifestos, conspiracy posts, absorbing them one after another until he no longer saw individuals, only sides. Eventually, he stopped debating people and started preparing. In his late 20s, he withdrew from society entirely, moving back into his mother's home while secretly planning something he considered historic. He was not unemployed, he was waiting. In 2009, he rented a remote farmhouse in the village of Asta, claiming he was starting an agricultural business. In truth, it became his workshop. He ordered chemicals in bulk, purchased fertilizer under false pretenses, and stored tools, fuel, and equipment. He spent long nights assembling what he would later refer to as his signal to the world, a homemade bomb weighing nearly a ton, constructed bag by bag, wire by wire. Meanwhile, he wrote a 1,500-page manifesto filled with political arguments, delusions of grandeur, and instructions for others to follow. He believed he was not committing a crime, but issuing a statement strong enough to force the world to pay attention. On July 22, 2011, Breivik began what he had rehearsed in his mind countless times. At 3:17 p.m., he parked a white van outside Norway's government headquarters in Oslo. The vehicle contained the bomb he had built by hand. After setting the fuse, he walked away with no sign of urgency. 8 minutes later, the explosion tore through the city center, sending glass, metal, and debris across blocks of offices and streets. Alarms echoed across Oslo, but Breivik never looked back. He was already on the road, executing the second half of his plan. His destination was Utoya Island, located about 25 miles northwest of the capital. The island was hosting a youth leadership camp for the Labour Party, whose values Breivik believed opposed his own. He arrived at the ferry dock wearing a police uniform, carrying a rifle and a handgun. He showed a fake badge and claimed he was there for security reasons following the Oslo blast. Staff believed him instantly. He boarded the ferry and crossed to the island without question. Minutes later, panic erupted. Witnesses said that he moved without hesitation, loading and reloading slowly, walking instead of running. He gave no speeches, no warnings. He acted as though he were following a routine. Some attendees fled into the woods, others into the water, some hid among rocks. The chaos lasted over an hour, while police struggled to coordinate transport to the island. Norway's Special Response Unit had to locate boats, navigate distance, and approach carefully without knowing the situation on the ground. Meanwhile, calls flooded emergency lines as phones rang endlessly in abandoned jackets and backpacks. At 6:34 p.m., law enforcement finally reached him. When officers confronted Breivik, he did not run. He placed his weapon on the ground and raised his hands. He surrendered calmly, telling officers his task was complete. No resistance, no apology. He asked to speak to an attorney. In custody, he explained everything with unsettling clarity. He claimed he was acting to protect Europe. Investigators listened as he described his months of preparation. They found receipts for chemicals, photos he took of himself in pseudo-military poses, files documenting his research, and the full manifesto he had published online hours before the attack. It was evident this was not an emotional outburst. It was a campaign he believed would be studied. Breivik was charged with terrorism and premeditated violence. Norway does not use the death penalty, so prosecutors sought preventive detention, the harshest sentence available, a 21-year term with the option for indefinite extensions. Psychiatrists debated whether he was sane or delusional. Breivik rejected any suggestion of illness, insisting he would rather be declared fully responsible than considered impaired. He viewed guilt as weakness. He wanted to be seen as intentional. In April 2012, his trial began. Families of victims filled the courtroom. Some refused to look at him. Others stared directly, unblinking. Breivik attempted to deliver long statements about his ideology, but judges cut him off. He demanded recognition. The court refused to give it. Witness after witness described the panic on the island. Survivors recounted pretending to be lifeless to avoid detection. Parents testified of final phone calls from children hiding in fear. Breivik listened without reaction. On August 24, 2012, the verdict was delivered. He was declared sane and fully responsible. He received 21 years of preventive detention, with the condition it could be extended for life without release. He was transferred to Skian prison, placed in near-complete isolation in a 3-room unit separated from other inmates for safety. Even those convicted of the country's worst crimes rejected him. He was kept alive only by policy, not by protection. He remains in isolation to this day, confined to silence. Number 3, Nicholas Cruz. Nicholas Cruz was not an unfamiliar face to those who lived in Parkland, Florida. Born on September 24, 1998, he was adopted as an infant along with his younger brother by Linda and Roger Cruz, an older couple who wanted to give both boys a better life. For years, neighbors saw what seemed like ordinary suburban parenting: birthday parties, school drop-offs, bikes in the driveway. But inside the home, stability was crumbling. His adoptive father died in 2004 when Nicholas was just 6. That loss reportedly changed him. He became more withdrawn, more restless. His mother did everything she could to manage his escalating behavior, but she struggled to control him. Teachers began reporting outbursts. Counselors noted emotional issues. He was transferred between schools repeatedly, from regular classes to alternative programs designed for students who needed constant supervision. He wasn't invisible. He was a warning signal no one could fully interpret, until it was too late. By adolescence, Cruz had already built a reputation among students as unpredictable. Some described him as quiet one moment and explosive the next, prone to angry disruptions in class. He was fascinated with weapons, talking frequently about knives and firearms, often posting about them online. He began uploading photos of himself, holding rifles and wearing tactical vests. Some classmates unfollowed him out of discomfort. Others reported his posts to school staff. At one point, he was even banned from carrying backpacks on campus due to safety concerns. Yet after years of intervention attempts, the system eventually released him. He withdrew from school in 2017. That same year, his adoptive mother, his last stable figure, died from illness. With no parents left, he moved between the homes of friends, carrying grief that no one fully understood. On February 14, 2018, Cruz returned to Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, where he had once been a student. He arrived by Uber shortly before 2:20 p.m., carrying a rifle case and a backpack full of loaded magazines. Surveillance cameras later showed him walking calmly through the halls. He pulled a fire alarm to draw students into the open, then positioned himself where the most damage could be done. The alarm sent hundreds of students into confusion. Within seconds, the sound of chaos filled the building. Some believed it was a drill. Others knew immediately it was real. Teachers barricaded doors. Students hid in closets and classrooms. Phone cameras captured shaking hands and silent tears. The attack lasted roughly 6 minutes before Cruz dropped his weapon and slipped out of the building, blending in with fleeing students. He walked to a nearby fast food restaurant, bought a drink, and sat at a table as if nothing had happened. At 3:41 p.m., a police officer spotted him walking down a residential street in the neighboring town of Coral Springs. The officer approached cautiously, but Cruz did not resist. He was detained without incident and transported to the station. Once in custody, he confessed to the attack. Investigators noted he spoke clearly, describing his actions step by step. There was no panic, no confusion, only acknowledgement. When questioned about motive, he gave no coherent explanation, only fragments of resentment and loneliness. The news spread across the nation within hours. Parents rushed to hospitals and shelters searching for their children. Police dispatch recordings revealed frantic calls from teachers whispering into phones while hiding with students. The incident quickly became one of the most widely covered school attacks in U.S. history. Protests erupted. Marches were organized. Survivors spoke publicly, demanding reform. But while the world debated policy, the legal process against Nicholas Cruz moved forward. He was charged with 17 counts of killing and 17 counts of attempted killing. Prosecutors announced immediately that they would seek the death penalty. His defense did not contest guilt. Instead, they focused on preventing execution. They argued that Cruz suffered from a long history of mental disorders, abandonment, and developmental issues. They presented school records, medical reports, and testimony from psychologists who claimed his mind had deteriorated from years of trauma. Prosecutors countered by pointing to the level of planning involved. He had purchased the rifle legally a year earlier. He had practiced with it. He had worn tactical gear. The attack was not impulsive. It was deliberate. In October 2022, the jury reached a decision. They spared his life by a narrow vote. Instead of execution, Nicholas Cruz was sentenced to 34 life sentences without the possibility of parole. One for each victim killed and each survivor injured. He was transferred to Florida's most secure facility, where inmates are confined to small cells under constant surveillance. There, he spends his days isolated, largely cut off from human interaction. He has no chance of release, no public platform, no path to redemption. His case became a nationwide conversation, but for him, that conversation ended the moment the cell door closed. Number 4, Brenton Tarrant. Brenton Harrison Tarrant was not from a war-torn country, nor from a background shaped by violence. He was born on October 27, 1990, in Grafton, a quiet rural town in New South Wales, Australia. His family was ordinary. His father was a competitive athlete turned garbage collector. His mother worked in education. There were no reports of abuse at home, no trauma in his early life. no criminal history throughout his youth. He played video games, worked out, and studied computers. In his teenage years, classmates remembered him as socially awkward but not confrontational. He kept to himself but never caused trouble. There was nothing in his childhood that suggested he would one day become responsible for one of the deadliest acts of violence in modern history. If anything, he was unremarkable. That was what made the transformation more chilling. He was not shaped by suffering. He was shaped by obsession. In his early 20s, his father passed away from cancer. After receiving an inheritance, Tarrant left Australia and began traveling extensively. He visited Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, claiming later that his exposure to certain political tensions influenced his worldview. Instead of broadening his perspective, travel narrowed it. He began spending long nights online, consuming extremist writings, conspiracy theories, and violent propaganda. He believed he was studying history. In reality, he was rewriting it in his own mind. For years, he lived like a ghost. No long-term job, no committed relationships, no permanent home, drifting from place to place while quietly assembling a worldview built on fear and superiority. He did not shout it in public. He refined it in silence. In 2017, Tarrant moved to New Zealand and settled in the quiet city of Dunedin. He joined a local gym, kept mostly to himself, and maintained a calm public image. Behind closed doors, he was preparing. He legally obtained firearms licenses and purchased multiple weapons, modifying them and inscribing them with references to historical battles and previous attackers. He outlined his intentions in a manifesto drafted over months, filled with lengthy justifications and warnings. In his mind, he was not a criminal. He was a symbol waiting to be activated. On March 15th, 2019, Tarrant set his plan into motion. It was a Friday afternoon, the main congregational prayer day for Muslims worldwide. At 1:40 p.m., he pulled up to Al-Noor Mosque in Christchurch, wearing tactical gear and carrying multiple firearms. He activated a body-mounted camera and began live streaming. Without a word, he approached the entrance and started firing. Worshippers who had gathered for prayer were thrown into panic. Some believed at first it was fireworks. By the time realization set in, there were few options for escape. Tarrant moved with methodical precision. He returned to his car to retrieve more weapons and re-entered the building without hesitation. He then drove across town to Linwood Islamic Center, arriving around 1:55 p.m. Again, he approached and carried out the same plan. By this point, police were converging from multiple directions. Driving away from the second mosque, Tarrant's vehicle was rammed from the side by officers. He was pulled from the car and restrained. Even during arrest, he did not resist. He appeared calm, almost indifferent. Within hours, the footage of his live stream had spread across social media, forcing platforms worldwide to scramble to contain it. New Zealand, a country rarely associated with such violence, was left in shock. While in custody, Tarrant told investigators he intended to continue further attacks if he had not been stopped. He offered no apology. He spoke about his actions as if he had fulfilled a duty. Officials charged him with 51 counts of killing, 40 counts of attempted killing, and 1 count of engaging in an act of terrorism under New Zealand's newly established laws. The trial was initially set for mid-2020, but before proceedings began, Tarrant unexpectedly changed his plea to guilty on all charges. There would be no prolonged courtroom debate, no attempt at defense. Survivors and families were allowed to deliver impact statements directly to him. One by one, they spoke of loss, fear, and resilience. Tarrant stared forward, offering no visible reaction. On August 27, 2020, the judge delivered his sentence. Brenton Tarrant became the first person in New Zealand's history to receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge stated plainly that he would never walk free again, calling his actions inhuman. He was transferred to a maximum security facility, placed under strict isolation protocols. Today, Tarrant wakes each morning to silence. There are no speeches, no audience, no movement beyond steel and concrete. He believed he would inspire a movement. Instead, he became an example of how swiftly society can contain hatred when it exposes itself. His name survives only in legal records and court documents. There are no monuments, no followers, no legacy beyond permanent isolation. He remains incarcerated in New Zealand under life imprisonment without parole, his future sealed by his own actions. Number 5. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo lived 2 lives. One was ordinary, the life people saw. The other was hidden in darkness, buried beneath decades of silence. Born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, DeAngelo grew up in a fractured household marked by instability and alleged abuse. His father, a U.S. Air Force sergeant, was strict and often absent. His mother struggled to manage the family while moving frequently between military bases. As a child, DeAngelo was described as quiet, observant, and unusually intense. Neighbors recalled that he watched people closely but rarely spoke to them. Even then, there was a distance in him that others could not explain. After high school, DeAngelo enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served during the Vietnam War. He returned home decorated, but changed. Military life had given him discipline, but it had also taught him how to stalk, surveil, and overpower. Instead of pursuing a civilian path, he entered law enforcement. In 1973, he joined the Exeter Police Department in California. Later, he became an officer in Auburn, near Sacramento. His colleagues saw him as strict, controlled, and intensely private. He demanded order. He issued tickets relentlessly. He had no tolerance for disorder, at least publicly. But while he upheld the law by day, investigators later learned that he was studying the weaknesses of others by night. Beginning in 1974, California saw a wave of home invasions across Visalia. A masked intruder would break into houses, often while the occupants slept. He stole small items, coins, jewelry, photos, objects of no real value except to disturb. Police dubbed him the Visalia Ransacker. They increased patrols, set traps, and established surveillance. But he always slipped away. At least one confrontation ended with a resident being killed at the scene after spotting him fleeing. When the pressure became too intense, he vanished, only to reappear miles north in Sacramento County under a new name, the East Area Intruder. His method escalated. He would stalk homes before entering, studying routines, learning floor plans. He often called victims beforehand, whispering threats, or simply breathing into the phone. Once inside, he displayed chilling patience. He tied up residents and stayed for hours, ransacking calmly while speaking in hushed, rehearsed tones. More than 50 households were attacked between 1976 and 1979. Police launched massive task forces. Towns held community meetings. Families bought dogs, floodlights, and guns. Yet the intruder remained uncatchable. Then, in 1979, something changed. DeAngelo was fired from the police force for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer. Small items, but enough to end his badge. He told the department he was framed. In truth, he had been arming himself. Within months, a new assailant appeared hundreds of miles away, this time in Southern California. Now he was known as the original Night Stalker. He did not break into empty houses anymore. He targeted couples. He waited until they slept, then entered silently. Neighbors frequently reported hearing muffled sounds but dismissed them as nightmares until morning. Cities like Irvine, Goleta, and Ventura were thrust into fear. Authorities connected the cases, realizing that a single individual had been responsible for years of terror across California. But they had no name, no face, no leads. And then, in 1986, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. For over 30 years, the case remained unsolved. Detectives retired with frustration. Files gathered dust. But families never forgot. In 2016, renewed efforts brought DNA technology into play. Investigators uploaded genetic material from old crime scenes to public genealogy databases, the kind used for ancestry research. Within months, the results narrowed to a family tree. From there, one name stood out: Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo was charged with multiple counts of killing and assault across 6 counties. Prosecutors sought life imprisonment. To avoid the death penalty, DeAngelo pleaded guilty in 2020 to 13 killings and 13 related offenses, while admitting responsibility for dozens more attacks beyond the statute of limitations. During the hearings, survivors and relatives faced him directly. Some spoke with trembling voices, others with steady resolve. DeAngelo sat motionless in a wheelchair, head down, offering no defense. On August 21, 2020, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge called him a predator unworthy of mercy. He was transferred to California State Prison, Corcoran, where he now spends his days in a small cell under watch. At 70 years old when he was arrested, and now approaching his 80s, he will die behind those walls. For over 4 decades, Joseph DeAngelo believed he had erased his past. He changed cities, changed names, became a father, a husband, a quiet neighbor. But science brought his silence to an end. He is no longer a phantom. He is inmate number, one of the most notorious in California history, and he will never leave his cell again. Number 6, David Berkowitz, son of Sam. David Berkowitz was not born into chaos. In fact, his first years of life seemed almost hopeful. He entered the world on June 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York, given the name Richard David Falco by his birth mother. She gave him up for adoption shortly afterward, and he was placed with Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a quiet, hard-working couple who owned a small hardware store. They renamed him David. His adoptive parents adored him, but even as a child, there were signs something was wrong. Teachers noted that he was intelligent but restless. Neighbors recalled that he seemed lonely even when surrounded by others. He struggled in school, not academically, but behaviorally. He lashed out unexpectedly, often without reason. Still, most chalked it up to adolescent moodiness. No one imagined he would one day become known as the son of Sam. As a teenager, Berkowitz developed an obsession with fire. He admitted later to setting dozens of small blazes around his neighborhood, not to harm, but to watch. He would stand at a distance and observe firefighters responding, fascinated by the chaos he alone had created. At 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and served 3 years, stationed in South Korea. By all accounts, he was disciplined and reliable, earning a sharpshooter qualification. When he returned to New York in 1974, he appeared calm on the outside. Inside, however, he felt more isolated than ever. His adoptive mother had died of cancer while he was deployed, leaving him deeply unmoored. He never fully recovered from that loss. After leaving the military, Berkowitz worked briefly as a security guard and later as a postal worker. He lived alone in a small apartment in Yonkers. It was there, according to his own accounts, that his internal world began to unravel. He claimed to hear voices, whispers he believed came from dogs demons, or supernatural forces. Whether these were hallucinations or self-crafted excuses remains debated. But by 1976, those thoughts had turned into actions. Berkowitz began driving aimlessly at night through the streets of New York City, searching for people he had never met, people who did not know he existed. Between the summer of 1976 and the summer of 1977, New York City fell into panic. Late at night, individuals sitting in parked cars were suddenly attacked without warning. News outlets reported a growing pattern. The victims were often young couples or women with long dark hair. A .44 caliber revolver was used in most cases, earning the attacker the nickname the .44 caliber shooter. Police formed a massive task force, interviewing thousands of citizens and following every lead. Despite their efforts, the attacks continued. The city's nightlife changed overnight. People cut their hair, clubs closed early, taxi drivers refused to pick up single riders. The turning point came when a handwritten letter was found near one of the scenes. Addressed to New York police and the media, it was signed Son of Sam. The letters were taunting, filled with cryptic language and theatrical references. Suddenly, the anonymous attacker had a persona. He wasn't seen, but he was heard. Newspapers published parts of the letters. Fear became obsession. Everyone wanted to know who he was. On July 31st, 1977, another attack occurred in Brooklyn. This time, a witness noticed something unusual. A suspicious man loitering near a yellow Ford Galaxy with a parking ticket. Police traced the ticket to an address in Yonkers. On August 10th, 1977, officers approached the building and found the car. Inside were a rifle and ammunition. They waited. Eventually, a man exited the building and headed toward the vehicle. Officers surrounded him and asked his name. He replied calmly, "I'm David Berkowitz." When they opened his car door, they found a written note. It began with 5 words, "I am the son of Sam." Once in custody, Berkowitz confessed immediately. He explained his actions without emotion. He claimed he had been commanded by voices, though later reports suggested he may have exaggerated those claims to avoid harsher legal consequences. Prosecutors charged him with multiple counts of killing and attempted killing. His lawyers initially entered an insanity plea, but psychological evaluations deemed him competent. On June 12, 1978, he pleaded guilty to all charges. Today, David Berkowitz remains incarcerated in Shawangunk Correctional Facility in New York. He is nearly 80 years old, spending most of his days reading, writing, and staying largely out of sight. He no longer makes headlines. His story is no longer one of pursuit. It is one of permanent confinement. He once sought attention through fear. Number 7. Richard Allen Davis. Richard Allen Davis was not shaped in one moment. He was shaped over years of unchecked violence. Born on June 2, 1954 in San Francisco, California, his life began in dysfunction. His parents were both heavy drinkers with long criminal histories of their own, constantly moving from one unstable situation to another. When they weren't fighting with each other, they were fighting with the law. Davis was shuffled between relatives, neighbors, and child welfare institutions before he even reached adolescence. He never developed roots, never formed stable attachments. Authority figures came and went. Teachers, counselors, probation officers, all labeling him the same way: emotionally detached, unpredictable, and resistant to correction. By age 11, he was already committing serious offenses: burglary, theft, assault, not petty mischief, but targeted aggression. California's juvenile system processed him repeatedly, yet each time he was released back into public life. As he grew older, his crimes escalated. In his late teens and early 20s, he was convicted multiple times for violent offenses, including kidnapping and assault. Each prison term ended with early parole. Each release led to more violence. By the early 1980s, Davis had a criminal record that stretched across counties. He cycled through prisons in California, Nevada, and Washington, serving time for everything from burglary to attempted kidnapping of young women. Psychological evaluators warned that he was dangerous. Some even stated that he lacked empathy entirely. Yet parole boards, constrained by overcrowding policies and optimistic rehabilitation programs, approved his release again and again. In one hearing, he promised to turn his life around. Weeks after being freed, he assaulted another victim. In 1993, Davis was released once more, this time after serving only half of a 16-year sentence. That decision would become one of the most scrutinized release orders in California criminal history. He returned to Sonoma County and began drifting between rural properties, drinking heavily and living on the fringes. On the night of October 1st, 1993, he was prowling the area near Petaluma, intoxicated and armed with a knife. At the same time, 12-year-old Polly Klaas was hosting a slumber party with two friends at her home. The girls were playing games in her bedroom when Davis entered through an open window, tying up Polly's friends before taking her and disappearing into the night. The investigation that followed became one of the largest child search operations in American history. Thousands of volunteers combed fields and forests. The case was featured on national television. Celebrities like Winona Ryder and the band Metallica raised money and awareness. Despite the nationwide attention, weeks passed with no answers. Then, a break came from a rural couple who had reported a trespasser on their property the night Polly disappeared. Police had questioned Davis at the time, but released him. When investigators revisited that lead and found items linking him to Polly's disappearance, they arrested him on a parole violation. A search of the property he had been camping on revealed crucial evidence. Confronted with mounting proof, Davis eventually confessed. The trial in 1996 was one of the most widely followed in California history. Spectators filled every seat. Reporters lined the hallways. The jury heard a detailed account of the crime. Davis's attorneys argued intoxication and traumatic upbringing, but the prosecution focused on his decades-long pattern of violent behavior. When the verdict was reached, guilty on all counts, the courtroom exploded in applause, something rarely tolerated but not silenced that day. During sentencing, Davis delivered one of the most infamous moments in courtroom history. When Polly's grieving father addressed him directly, Davis interrupted, not with remorse, but with a taunt, falsely blaming the father for what happened. Gasps filled the courtroom. Even experienced officers were stunned. It was one of the clearest public displays of his complete lack of empathy. The judge responded by imposing the maximum penalty, death. His final chapter is not appeal or redemption. It is silence, concrete, and time that will run out long before mercy ever enters his cell. Number 8. Ronnie O'Neal III. Ronnie O'Neal III was not born into anonymity. His face became known to millions overnight because of one courtroom moment that stunned the nation. Born in Tampa, Florida in 1989, O'Neal grew up in the Riverview community just outside Tampa Bay. His early life was troubled, though not publicly documented in full. Friends and neighbors recalled a charismatic but volatile figure, someone who could be charming in conversation but aggressive when challenged. He spoke loudly about faith, distrust of the government, and self-reliance. At times, he seemed like a passionate father and partner. At others, he appeared unpredictable, driven more by impulse than logic. Before tragedy struck, nobody imagined that his name would one day be permanently attached to one of Florida's most disturbing household crimes. O'Neal lived with his partner, Kenyatta Barron, and their two children, a daughter and a son. Outwardly, the family looked like any other. Photos showed smiles. Social media posts showed pride. But behind closed doors, arguments had begun escalating. There were calls to police for domestic disturbances, though no major charges were filed. Whatever tension existed inside that home reached its breaking point on the night of March 18th, 2018. Just before midnight, a 911 call came from the Barron home. A woman, panicked and injured, was heard screaming for help. Before the call disconnected, a loud voice shouted, and then silence. When sheriff's deputies arrived minutes later, the house was engulfed in smoke and flames. Neighbors watched in confusion as first responders tried to contain both a fire and a crime scene at the same time. Paramedics found one adult woman in the yard, severely wounded, barely alive. She later died at the scene. Inside the home, firefighters discovered a young child who had also lost their life before the fire consumed the structure. Authorities located a second child, badly injured but alive, fleeing from the house. That child would later become the most unexpected key witness in the entire case. Ronnie O'Neill was found walking outside, covered in blood. He was detained immediately. Investigators pieced together a timeline that pointed directly to him as responsible. Forensic evidence tied him to every act of violence inside the home. First responders reported hearing him shouting religious phrases as he was taken into custody. There was no mystery about who had committed the act. The only remaining question was why. Once arrested, O'Neill refused to accept legal representation. He insisted on defending himself in court, a rare decision for someone facing the death penalty. His trial in June 2021 quickly gained national attention due to his explosive behavior in the courtroom. Rather than present a measured argument, O'Neill delivered long, chaotic speeches. He raised his voice at jurors, accused prosecutors of lying, and repeatedly declared conspiracy against him. At one point, he screamed so loudly that courtroom recordings distorted. Viewers described it as surreal, more like a performance than a defense. But the most unforgettable moment came when O'Neill chose to cross-examine his own son, the sole surviving witness, who testified remotely because of his young age. The child calmly stated, when asked who hurt the family, "You did." The entire courtroom fell silent. During sentencing, prosecutors sought the death penalty. Under Florida law, jurors must vote unanimously for execution. In O'Neill's case, they did not reach that unanimity. Instead, the court imposed life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, delivering the sentence, looked directly at O'Neill and said, "This is the most horrific case I have ever seen in my 40 years in this courtroom." Even then, O'Neill had no remorse. He raised his voice to declare he would see everyone again in the afterlife. He will never walk free again. Number 9. Abu Hamza al-Masri, Mustafa Kamel. Mustafa arrived in Britain as a young man with the kind of quiet ambition that could have led to any ordinary life. Born in Alexandria, Egypt, in April 1958, he moved to the United Kingdom in his early 20s to study and work. For a time, he held odd jobs, married a British woman, and raised a family. To neighbors, he appeared to be another immigrant building a life in London, a man who had left home for new opportunities and settled into the rough rhythm of day labor, prayer, and community. What shifted was gradual but unmistakable. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Mustafa had embraced a new public identity as a cleric and adopted the name Abu Hamza. His appearance became as notable as his voice. He had lost both hands and one eye in an incident he later described in different ways, and he began wearing the metal hooks that would become a defining image. He was tall, imposing, and capable of filling a room. He spoke in a booming baritone from mosque pulpits and on videotapes that made their way around more than just congregations. People came for comfort and left with a message that in some corners felt like a call to division rather than unity. The place most associated with his rise was the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London. Once a neighborhood institution, it began to change under his influence. Where the mosque had previously focused on community services and worship, critics and intelligence officers later said it had become a gathering point where hardline rhetoric circulated and where young men were exposed to increasingly radical ideas. Over time, authorities and journalists linked a number of violent actors, some later implicated in international attacks and plots, to networks that had intersected with the mosque. British counter-terrorism units began to watch closely. Abu Hamza's sermons were public and theatrical. He denounced Western foreign policy, presented a stark US versus them worldview, and occasionally described violent resistance in language that many heard as encouragement. He framed conflicts in remote regions as moral imperatives. For listeners who were already vulnerable or searching for identity, his words were a provocation. For authorities, the pattern was clear. An imam with a platform whose rhetoric could feed recruitment to extremist groups, including those linked to Al-Qaeda and affiliated militant organizations operating in Afghanistan and Yemen. British police moved cautiously at first. The country's strong protections for speech and religion required that authorities build a clear legal case before curtailing a preacher's public platform. Investigators compiled recordings, collected testimonies from former congregants, and traced networks of contacts across borders. In 2004, domestic prosecutors charged Abu Hamza with incitement to violence among other offenses. In 2006, a UK court convicted him on several counts and sentenced him to 7 years in prison. That conviction was only the beginning of a far longer legal battle. While he served time in Britain, American prosecutors pursued more serious allegations. The United States filed extradition requests accusing him of conspiracy to establish a training camp in Oregon, of facilitating hostage-taking in Yemen, and of providing material assistance to violent groups overseas. U.S. authorities presented a narrative in which he did not act alone as a preacher, but served as a facilitator, using his position, contacts, and rhetoric to help others move from words into violent action. For years, his legal team fought extradition on human rights grounds, arguing that he faced an unfair trial or harsh treatment if sent to the United States. The extradition battle was lengthy and complex. British courts reviewed the evidence, examined his health and detention conditions, and considered the diplomatic implications of sending a high-profile defendant across the Atlantic. Civil liberties organizations weighed in on both sides, concerned about free speech limits and equally concerned about public safety. Ultimately, in 2012, the British courts approved extradition. He was flown to the United States under heavy security. Tried in federal court in New York in 2014, Abu Hamza faced an array of charges that did not allege he personally carried out international attacks, but accused him of supporting, organizing, and facilitating them. Prosecutors presented witness testimony, intercepted communications, and financial records demonstrating that he had been part of networks that sought to recruit, train, and assist militants. They pointed to his role in helping coordinate movements and in promoting material support for violent groups, including organizations aligned with or inspired by Al-Qaeda affiliates in the region. Defense lawyers argued that his activities were protected religious or charitable works gone wrong, or that they had been misinterpreted by authorities. They emphasized his right to free speech and questioned the credibility of some witnesses. But the prosecution's case painted a consistent picture. A public figure who used the authority of a mosque and the reach of modern communications to channel resources and rhetoric toward violent ends. In 2014, a federal jury convicted him on multiple counts, including hostage-taking conspiracy and providing material support to terrorism. The sentence was severe. In 2015, the judge imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court's written decision emphasized not only the gravity of his conduct, but also the potential consequences of allowing such facilitation to go unchecked. When the U.S. justice system speaks in a case like this, it speaks in measured legal terms, but the meaning is plain. The actions were judged to have materially aided dangerous operations. For someone who had spent decades on pulpits and in front of cameras, that shrinkage was absolute. The man who once filled rooms and addressed crowds now existed in a space of concrete, steel, and silence. His hooks, once a visual element of his persona, lost their past. Symbolic power. They became part of a prisoner's inventory rather than a pulpit's prop. His movements, speech, and communications were curtailed not to stifle debate, but to remove a practical conduit through which violent networks could be supported. Outside, the wider debates his case raised continued. Civil liberties scholars argued about the limits of free speech in democratic societies. Security officials debated the best methods for preventing radicalization while protecting civil rights. Communities that once attended his mosque worked to rebuild trust, promote integration, and support families vulnerable to extremist messaging. The law responded with prosecutions. The courts affirmed legal standards, and governments increased surveillance and community outreach programs intended to stop recruitment before it starts. He sits now under lock and watch, contained by the measures of the law he once challenged. Number 10. Lori Vallow Daybell. Lori Vallow Daybell did not begin her life in infamy. Born on June 26, 1973 in California, she grew up in what appeared to be a stable, religious, middle-class family. Those who knew her in childhood described her as cheerful, charismatic, and deeply involved in her faith. She married young, first at 19, then again and again. Over the years, she would have 5 marriages in total. Friends later said she seemed obsessed with the idea of being chosen for a higher purpose, often referencing spiritual battles between light and darkness. At first, this appeared to be exaggerated religious rhetoric. Many dismissed it as harmless fantasy. But for Lori, belief and reality were blurring into something dangerous. By 2014, she was married to Charles Vallow, a successful businessman who adopted her young daughter Tylee and helped raise her son, Joshua J.J. Vallow, who had autism. To neighbors in Arizona, they looked like a devoted family. Lori was attentive, energetic, and loving, at least in public. But privately, she began immersing herself in apocalyptic teachings. She became obsessed with doomsday podcasts, near-death testimonies, and fringe authors who spoke of spiritual wars on Earth. That was when she met one of those authors, Chad Daybell. In July 2019, Charles was shot and killed by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, inside Lori's home. Alex claimed self-defense, saying Charles had attacked him, and police initially accepted the story. Lori seemed unfazed. Within weeks, she moved to Idaho, bringing Tylee, then 16, and JJ, then 7. She began spending more time with Chad Daybell, whose own wife, Tammy, was reportedly healthy, until suddenly she wasn't. In October 2019, Tammy died in her sleep at the age of 49. Her death was ruled natural at first. 10 days later, Lori and Chad flew to Hawaii and secretly married. Back in Idaho, family members started asking questions. No one had seen Tylee or JJ in weeks. Police launched welfare checks. Lori told officers that JJ was staying with friends. That turned out to be false. When authorities ordered her to produce the children, she refused. She left Idaho again and returned to Hawaii with Chad, without either child. National attention erupted. Where were Tylee and JJ? Why were Lori and Chad avoiding every question? Why were 2 spouses suddenly dead and 2 children missing? In February 2020, Lori was arrested in Hawaii and extradited to Idaho. Even behind bars, she refused to explain where her children were. Months passed with no answers. Then, in June 2020, investigators searched Chad Daybell's property. On his land, buried beneath freshly disturbed soil, they discovered human remains. The remains were later confirmed to be those of Tylee and JJ. Tylee's remains showed signs of burning. JJ had been found wrapped and concealed. The investigation shifted from missing persons to homicide. Public shock turned to disbelief. How could a mother, someone once seen smiling at school events, abandon her own children so completely? Prosecutors alleged that Lori and Chad believed the children were dark spirits who had become obstacles to their divine mission. Text messages obtained by investigators suggested they had classified friends and relatives into spectral categories like light and dark, making decisions about who could live based on delusional spiritual rankings. In 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell stood trial in Idaho. The courtroom was filled with grieving relatives, reporters, and spectators still trying to understand how faith could become fanaticism. The prosecution presented digital messages, travel records, and testimony from former friends who described Lori's descent into obsession. They argued that she orchestrated not only the deaths of her children, but also played a role in the deaths of both her husband and Chad's wife. The defense attempted to argue mental instability, but the jury saw intent. They saw planning. They saw choice. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict: guilty on all counts. Lori was convicted of killing both of her children and of conspiracy to kill Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell. At sentencing, the judge condemned her actions as the most shocking betrayal a mother can commit. He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Instead, the only world she will ever see again is made of cement, steel, and locked doors.